I have a wilderness story that I'd like to share with you guys this morning. I was a Boy Scout. I know that's surprising. A lot of you are like, I cannot believe that Lucas is a Boy Scout. I'm actually an Eagle Scout. That's also quite a surprise for some people too. But my first Boy Scout trip I want to tell you guys about. So I was about 12 years old, and me and a bunch of kids in my troop loaded up in a bright orange bus, and we drove all the way across Kansas to Salida, Colorado. This trip was absolutely amazing. The first day on the trip, we go whitewater rafting, and we were rafting down the river, and the rafting guide thought it would be a great idea to put all of us in the back of the raft and then tie a rope to the front of the raft. There was a 400-pound kid in my youth group sitting in the back, and we're all back there, and he thought it would be a great idea to pop wheelies over the rocks in the river. So we are going down. The first rock we hit, the boat goes end for end over. We all go flying out of the raft, and we ended up under the water, under the raft. Obviously, I survived this experience, but that was the first day of this Boy Scout adventure. The second day, we are going to summit a 14er, and so we get almost to the summit, and this kid in my troop breaks his leg. I'm like, are you serious right now? And so we had to make a stretcher, carry him all the way down the mountain. That's day 2 of the trip. All right, day 3, I go to sleep. I'm passed out in my tent, and like 2 o'clock in the morning, I get woken up by a woman yelling, "Help me, help me, help me." And I'm like, do I dare open my tent and peek out right now? So I do. I look out, and what do I see? I see a woman getting dragged out of her tent by a bear. Yeah, a bear. Seriously. So I go running out. Me and my friends start banging pots and pans, scaring this bear out of the... I'm like, lady, what's going on? And she said, I was asleep, and I had my tent flaps open, and then the bear came in, and I woke up, and I tried punching the bear. And I'm like, what are you thinking? And so it was crazy. And then the 4th day of the trip, we're like on our way home. It's time to go home. We're out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, all right? And the bus breaks down. It's 100 degrees outside. We were unprepared Boy Scouts. We had no food or water, and back then cell phones weren't that great. I think they might have still been in a bag or something. I don't know, but here we are, and we're like, what are we gonna do? And we're like 10 miles outside of Goodland, Kansas, and this farmer drives up to us, and he's like, do you guys need any help? We're like, yeah, we need some water. And he's like, I got some in the back of my truck, but I'll sell it to you for $6 a bottle. We're like, no, we're not going to buy that. Like, this is the craziest trip of my life. And I think we all have moments in our life that change us, right? Like, here's some things that this trip changed my opinion of. No offense to moms. They're great. My mom was awesome. But it kind of changed my opinion on moms being on Boy Scout trips. I mean, this lady had food in her tent. She had shampoo in her tent, and she gets attacked by a bear. I mean, it's crazy. And then the other thing is I realized that Goodland, Kansas is not so good. I mean, $6, I mean, crazy. It's the craziest trip. You see, we all know that every second is the same length, but not the same importance. You see, certain seconds and moments of our lives matter more than others. You see, we pass through most of our days without paying much attention, and then suddenly something happens. Everybody remembers 9/11, don't they? This moment changed us. It changed our country. And some people, they remember the time they found out they were pregnant, or when they gave birth. Or they remember the moment in their life when they found out that someone they love has passed away. You see, life just seems to stop for a little while. And seconds seem elongated because there's so much emotion and meaning packed into them. And others remember the moment that they fell in love. Like everything was just going along just fine, and then bam, in an instant you knew that everything was going to change. And for others, it's the moment that they discovered their calling. Like suddenly they were confronted with a problem or an issue that they hungered to solve. And they discovered a gift that they realized that they had. You see, in that moment, they realized something new about the way that God had made them and the reason why they are alive. You see, I remembered vividly the moment I truly started following Jesus. But I also remember the moment where my grandparents passed away that I was extremely close to. And I also remember, just like yesterday, the moment that I held my daughter Lily for the very first time. And then I remember, just like yesterday, when she turned 2 years old, which was pretty much just like yesterday. There she is, 2 years old, right? I learned something. She woke up at 2:30 in the morning on her birthday yelling, "Daddy, Daddy, it's my happy day, it's my happy day." I'm like, "You're crazy, it's 2:30 in the morning, go back to bed." And I learned something at her birthday party too. At a birthday party with a bunch of kids that are 2 years old, you should not get bright blue frosting on the cake when you have white carpet and white furniture. That is not a good idea. But you see, I remember these moments so well, but I also remember the moment in the emergency room when the doctors told us there was no way that she was going to survive the pregnancy. So I also remember so many moments and instances in my life where God showed up miraculously by providing or proving himself in ways that I never expected, in ways that changed my life forever. Do you have moments in your life that have changed everything for you? You see, usually it's in those moments that are filled with extreme emotions, moments filled with joy or happiness or peace and hope. Or maybe they're moments that are filled with anger or doubt or despair. Maybe there was an opportunity or an encounter that you had in your life that shaped your soul and altered the course of your life. The passages that we're in today, Moses had a moment like that, but it wasn't the first one. You see, this morning we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3. And for those of you that don't know that much about the book of Exodus, it's a story of God leading people from captivity out of the wilderness and into community. You see, this story opens up with the Israelites who are suffering the most ruthless kind of slavery at the hand of the Egyptians. But God had a plan to save them. Because Exodus begins with the birth of Moses, and he would be the one that God would use to rescue and save the Hebrew slaves and to bring them out of the wilderness. And in order to accomplish that, God engineers some very unusual circumstances for Moses. You see, the first is he was born to a Hebrew mother, and then he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and then he was sent back to his birth mom so that she could nurse him, and then once he was weaned off of that, then he was yanked right back into Pharaoh's palace where he would be educated and refined to become a prince. And you see, this experience uniquely prepared Moses to be the insider-outsider who would have this dual identity that God would use to set his people free. But all that going back and forth for Moses had some repercussions. And it probably left him with a bunch of chaotic emotions and a confused identity. Because he lived between two worlds. He lived between two worlds. And he wasn't at home at either place. He wasn't embraced by either place as well. Some of us here today know exactly what that's like to grow up in two homes, right? And two different kinds of cultures. Who was Moses? Who was his family? Was he an Egyptian prince, or was he a Hebrew slave? Was he the oppressor, or was he the oppressed? Should Moses feel blessed, or should he feel guilty? He's not sure. And all of this raw, unprocessed emotion hit a boiling point when one day he went out to where his people were and he was watching them do hard labor as slaves. And he's standing there and he's going, "Why are they down there, but I'm up here?" You can imagine the chaotic feelings that he must have had in that moment. And then the wave of emotions escalated immediately when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And we got to realize that in that moment, that's what Moses was made for. God had equipped him to address this exact injustice. This was his call to action. If Moses had only recognized what God was doing and what God had been preparing him for his entire life. You see, this might have been the moment where his life would have made sense. You see, God was calling him through this fire that was burning in his soul, but instead of inspiring him, this moment consumed him. Because he was so blinded by his unprocessed and unresolved rage and guilt and resentment that he missed God's invitation in this moment. So you see, self-righteously, he tried to accomplish God's will, but not in God's way. You see, the Hebrews were held captive by the Egyptians, but Moses was held captive by his unexamined emotions. We see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 12, it says this: "So looking this way and that way and seeing no one, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. You see, his whole life had set him up for this moment. Moses had the power to do something about this injustice. He was a prince. He could have used his authority to change the system and to set his people free. But Moses, he missed this moment. He gave in to his rage, and it went down into flames. Because when Pharaoh heard about what Moses had done, he went and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled to the far side of the desert, and he squandered all the authority that God had given him. We all have moments like that in our lives, don't we? Moments where we just completely blew it and ruined everything. Hopefully for you, that didn't end up in murder, right? I mean, let's hope not, but you never know. You see, there are moments in our life in extreme exhaustion or embarrassment or anger or anxiety. And what happens sometimes in those moments? We let reckless words fly and kill the spirit of our spouse or our children or our friends or people that we love. Or maybe we don't say anything at all. We just completely ghost that person. We give them the silent treatment because we're upset. We've all had times where we behave in childish and self-centered and impatient ways that result in consequences that we later on regret. All of us have done that. We all do that. Because whatever it was that provoked you, maybe it was your child disobeying you. Maybe it was a friend's joke that tapped into your unresolved feeling of insecurity or disrespect that you experienced earlier on in your life. So instead of seeing that moment as an opportunity for discipleship in your child or your friend or even yourself, right, you crack down viciously in a way that does nothing to heal you, but only wounds the other person. Maybe there's a time in your life where somebody challenged or questioned an opinion you have. That never happens during this political season, right? None of us have been there. Or maybe somebody questioned a decision that you made as a leader and you blew up because you felt like they were challenging the core of who you are, that they didn't value you, that they didn't think that you had any legitimacy to make the decision that you made. When in fact, God has given you a gift through them by helping you see something in yourself that maybe you're blind to so that you can accomplish something even better with your life. You see, when I first started out in ministry 12 years ago, I was leading a meeting that didn't go very well. That might be a surprise to some of you, but I just had this meeting and it did not go that great. Because there were some people in this meeting that were accusing me of things that I felt like were unfair. And I was irritated and upset. And back in that time, early on in my career, I used to get upset pretty easily, and I would get irritated, and I would get forceful. But I thank God that in this moment, I actually kept my mouth shut. Because after my emotions calmed, you want to know what I realized? The stuff they were upset about was actually my fault. You see, so the others were responding very reasonably. But it was only later did I recognize what God was doing in that situation. He wasn't sending me into this meeting to set everybody straight, but he was inviting me to see how much pride I had so that I could let that go and so that I could leave and serve him in a better way. You see, like Moses, in that moment, I almost missed it because it didn't occur to me that God might be using these people who were resisting and annoying me to help heal me and to help me grow. It was a gift, but I almost missed it. You see, other times, it's not our chaotic emotions that make us miss God, but it's our frantic pace in life. We are so busy. And maybe somebody says something to you and you just completely blow them off because you're too busy and you're not realizing that they're trying to reach out and make a connection to you that they needed. Or maybe it was a connection that you needed. Maybe it was a moment that God was trying to put you in touch with a future spouse or a future employer or a future disciple. Maybe it was someone that you've been in conflict with, and they were trying to reach out and extend an olive branch to ask for forgiveness. But you missed it because you let your busyness or maybe your bitterness prevent you from seeing that God was trying to bring healing and restoration in that moment. That's why Hebrews warns us to not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. That person that you blew off, that may have been God coming to you in some form, but you missed it because you weren't paying attention to the nudge that the Holy Spirit was giving you to stop and to care. You see, that day in Egypt, God was calling Moses into ministry, but Moses missed it, and it changed the course of his life. Because as Pharaoh's anger burned, Moses got benched, right? He was exiled to taking care of somebody else's sheep in the far side of the desert, and he was out there for 40 years. And it must have seemed like God had forgotten Moses out there, right? Because essentially Moses had been demoted from a prince to a parking lot attendant for somebody else's sheep for 40 years. But God had not forgotten Moses. You see, God was training Moses because God was there the whole time. Moses, he already had all the gifts that he needed to be a good leader. But what he needed is he needed to be emptied of his ego and his pride and his anger that kept him from loving other people and listening to God. You see, in the wilderness, God taught Moses patience and humility and how to lead and feed a flock that wasn't his own, so that one day he could lead God's people out of Egypt. We read in Exodus chapter 2, it says that during that long period, the king of Egypt died. And in verse 23, it says this: the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And then it goes on to say, God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. It's time to give Moses another shot. Because we see at the beginning of Exodus chapter 3 that one morning Moses led his sheep out to graze just like he did every other day. And there's nothing special about that. And we read that they were grazing on Mount Horeb, which sounds like a spiritual, majestic mountaintop kind of place, but it's not. I mean, it's spiritual and majestic if you're thinking of the Rocky Mountains or the Swiss Alps. But Mount Horeb was nothing like that. It's just a random pile of rocks in the middle of a harsh, dry desert. And this was just an ordinary day, just like any other day for the past 40 years for Moses. But while Moses was standing around for hours, he saw something strange. It says in Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it didn't burn up. You see, that would have been a strange sight in the first place. But what made it even more strange is that the fire didn't burn up the bush. You see, Moses had felt a fire inside of him years ago. But what happened? That fire consumed him. And yet this bush burns without being consumed. How is that possible? And so Moses thought, he thinks, I'll go over there and I'll see this strange sight. He's thinking, why doesn't this bush burn up? You see, Moses notices something out of the ordinary and he pays attention. Because he realized in this moment that something special is happening. And even though he wasn't sure what was going on, it must have been confusing, right? And probably a little bit scary to see this. But instead of just rushing right by this burning bush, instead of running away, what does Moses do? He walks closer. And it was then that God speaks to him. Because God had been there all along with Moses. God was the fuel for this undying fire, but God didn't speak to Moses until he stopped to pay attention. You see, there are moments in our life where God shows up unexpectedly in ways that are right in the middle of our ordinary daily life. And sometimes those moments can seem confusing or scary. But that's often where we'll find God speaking to us if we're willing to pay attention, if we don't just rush right by. You see, Moses missed it the first time God called him, but this time he responded differently. In verse 4, it goes on to say, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place that you are standing is holy ground. You see, holy means something different or special or set apart. And I think sometimes we've heard this story so many times that we don't really think much about that statement. And you see, this week as I was preparing for the sermon, I thought it was kind of funny. Because when I think of a holy place, I think of places like Notre Dame or St. Peter's Basilica or a place with stained glass windows or Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, right? That's a holy place. But this is Mount Horeb. It's an ugly, unremarkable rock in the middle of the desert. And do you know what Horeb means in Hebrew? It means wasteland. There's nothing holy about this place. There's nothing special about it. It's just an ordinary place on an ordinary day. until Moses realized that God was there. Because wherever God is a holy and special place. See, things aren't special on their own. Things and places are special depending on who is there, right? I mean, how many restaurants and hotels and places advertise that this famous person ate here, or this person slept in this hotel room? Why do they do that? Because they're trying to entice you to go there because they think that place is more special because that person was there. You see, I don't need to go to St. Peter's Basilica, or I don't need to go to Notre Dame or even Faith Community to see God. Because any place that I notice God can become a holy place. And any moment can become your holy moment. Your dinner table tonight with your family can become a holy place. The moments you spend with your children or your grandchildren can become your holy moment with your family. Or maybe those moments in your life where you finally stop doing those destructive things that you've been doing, that time can become a holy moment for you and your family. But you see, in order to create those holy moments, we need to stop and pay attention and realize that God has been with us all along. Any moment can become holy when you pay attention, because God can speak to you in those moments. And just like God spoke to Moses through the burning bush, you see, those moments where God speaks to us can change whatever situation you are in an instant. So at moments in your life where you feel fear or greed or rage or doubt or defensiveness, I encourage you to stop and ask the question of what is God doing in all of this? Where is God in all of this? What is God trying to say to me in this moment? How can I follow God in this moment to bring healing and life rather than pain and division? You see, when Moses listened, God said, starting in verse 7, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. You see, that's what Moses was born to do. That's the fire that had been burning inside of him 40 years ago. But at that time, rather than look to God in that moment, Moses took matters into his own hands, and he almost ruined everything. Or at least he postponed it for a little while. But what would have happened if Moses had listened to God all those years ago? Maybe the Israelites would have been set free much sooner, or things might have been much easier. We'll never know, because Moses didn't look for God in that moment. He just reacted to his emotions in a way that was deadly. But you see, the good news for each of us in this story is this. Because like Moses, a lot of us have missed God in important moments in our lives. And maybe because of that, we've done something destructive. Maybe we've ruined a relationship or our reputation or our career. You see, those moments, because I've been there many times in my own life, those moments can feel like they're the end of the road. Like we sit there and think, my story's over. But here's the deal, here's the hope. No matter how bad it is, whatever it was, I bet it wasn't as bad as Moses, right? Moses murdered somebody, which was a total disaster. And yet God was not done with Moses. So whatever you're going through in your life, no matter how bad it is, God is not done with you. You see, this story of Moses shows us both the danger of missing God, but as Dylan so beautifully shared this past Wednesday, Moses also shows us the possibility of redemption that God can bring to each and every single one of us, no matter what our mistakes were. Maybe this right now is a holy moment for some of you. If you just stop this morning long enough to see God in the midst of your challenges and your trials. You see, before Moses could lead anyone else out of bondage, he first needed to be freed from captivity to his own anger and pride. And that's always true for us. Because before God can do great through you, he has to start by doing something great in you. What does God need to do in your life today? What does God need to work on in your life so that you can serve him in a better way? So that you can serve God in the way that you were created for? What's getting in the way of you doing that? if you want to be transformed and led out of the wilderness and be used by God in a way where God will use your wilderness story to change lives for eternity, it starts by first paying attention to Him. But like I said, many of us, we live at such a frantic speed that we rush right by any burning bush around us. We miss them without even noticing that God has been there all along. And then what do? We sit there and we wonder, God, why do you seem so far away? God is never far away. God is everywhere. Like, what does David say in Psalm 139? He says this: where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. You see, David's point is that there is no place that God is not there. But what there are a lot of places that we don't expect to see God because they maybe seem so mundane. And that assumption makes us miss God because we're not even looking for Him. You see, if we make a regular practice of slowing down to look, here's what we're going to realize. We're going to realize and discover that we are standing on holy ground a lot more often than we realize. You see, a few weeks ago, I was commenting to some friends of mine. I was talking to them about how it seems like I never get an opportunity to interact with people who aren't Christians. Nothing personal. I love Christians, but I've always felt God calling me to share His love with people that don't know Him. And I kept thinking, like, how am I going to share the good news with people if everybody I talk to already knows about it? And as I went through the next day, I started paying attention, and here's what happened. I stopped at McDonald's like I do every single morning for breakfast, and what do? I order at the kiosk because honestly, I don't want to talk to anybody, right? And then after work, I go home, and on my way home, I stop at the grocery store, and what do? I go through the self-checkout line because I don't want to talk to anybody. And then what do? I get home, and I go and I walk my dog around the neighborhood, and what do? I put noise-canceling headphones in because I don't want to talk to my neighbors, right? And then the next day, I'm sitting there, and I'm asking God, why don't I ever get an opportunity to talk to anybody about you, right? And during that time of prayer, I was challenged by God to start doing things differently. So the next day, I went back and I ordered at that McDonald's, and I ordered at the counter, even though the kiosk was working. And guess what happened? I started talking to the manager that I've seen almost every day for the last 8 months. And she starts telling me about her awesome vacation that she just had with her children. And then I stopped at this gas station that I stop at all the time. And I started talking to this lady, and she started telling me about her family that lives overseas and about the financial concern that she had for them. And then that afternoon, I got a text from somebody I'd never met before. And he said, Lucas, I'm a funeral director here in town, and I need someone to do a funeral. And I asked another church, and I asked him, I said, do you know anybody that's a pastor in this community that is good at being with people who are not the normal kind of crowd? Do you know somebody who's a pastor that is good at connecting with people who aren't Christians? So he texted me, and I get this text, and I'm like, I wanted to say no. I literally thought of excuses for 3 days to get out of this funeral because I've done ministry 12 years, and I've done a lot of things to try to avoid doing funerals because I feel like I'm not qualified. And I kept there thinking, I'm like, I got to work at Green Ride, so I can't get out of that, and that's my excuse. So on the third day, he texts me, and he's like, Lucas, I need an answer. And I felt like God in that moment saying, Lucas, you need to do the funeral. You need to do the funeral. And I'm like, God, what am I going to say? And he said, just tell them about me. Tell them how to get to heaven. Because here's the deal. I didn't know who this girl was. This funeral was for a 24-year-old girl who died of a drug overdose. I'd never met her before. What am I going to say? All I did is I stood up there and I preached how to get to heaven. That's all I did. I don't know if it made a difference or not. I don't know. But you see, my burning bush moments simply started by paying attention and listening to what God was asking me to do. Just like you, I have so many things going on in my life. I have so many pressures and demands and deadlines that I need to be deliberate about slowing down, to stop and to listen, and to see where God is, because there's holy ground everywhere I go. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm somebody that needs specific examples of what to do. And so I wanted to give you some this morning. I'll wrap this up here real quick. What if for the rest of Lent, if all of us as a church took 5 minutes before bed each and every single night to pray through the past day and to acknowledge where we saw God at work, and then notice where we may have missed him? And then what if we prayed through the next day so that we don't miss God there? And what if we took time throughout the rest of Lent to gather with our friends and family to share God sightings? Because sharing stories of where we have seen God at work helps us realize that we are standing on holy ground all the time. What if we woke up every morning before our family and we prayed for our children, and if we prayed for our spouses? Or what if we showed up to work early or our schools early and we prayed for the meetings that we're going to have or the classes that we're going to have? What if we prayed for the content of those meetings and prayed for all the people that we're going to come in contact with? And what if we realize as a church that every moment and every place is holy ground where God can speak and use us if we're willing to listen? God is everywhere. And life as a follower of Jesus is where we recognize the burning bushes in our lives and see them in places we don't usually look in. That includes in our triumphs and in our trials and in the busyness of our daily lives, so that we can hear God speak to us and then respond. I encourage you this week, if you get bad news this week or a bad diagnosis, I encourage you, God is there. Look for God in those moments. What feels like a wasteland or a Horeb in your life, a horrible place, can become a holy place. Whether you're at a party or in an emergency room, or if it's just a boring day at home or work, God is there. Stop and look. That place can become a holy moment because that place is holy ground where God will speak to you in ways that you never expected. Is there a place in your life that feels like a Horeb, a wasteland, where you feel far from God? Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's at your workplace or your school. Maybe it's a decision that you're stuck in the middle of. You see, the journey of getting out of the wilderness begins by recognizing that God is always there, and to listen to God and to obey what he is asking you to do. If you feel stuck during this Lenten season, I invite you to start looking for God in the Horebs in your life and to do whatever he commands, because that is the only way out of the wilderness and into the promised land. Amen. God, we thank you for this morning, this time to gather together on holy ground in this holy place with our church family. God, I pray as we leave here today, God, that we would always recognize that you are with us in each and every single moment of our lives. God, whether it feels like a wasteland or whether it feels like the promised land, you are there, God. So I pray that we would be encouraged by your presence in our lives, God, and that would give us hope as we leave here this morning. In your name I pray, amen.